Howdy ladies and gentlemen. Today I want to talk about the different settings that I have on my camera to kind of create that cinematic look that I have in my vlogs and my videos and all sorts of things. As far as the actual settings, I shoot it at 1080p, 24 frames per second. What that literally means is it's taking 24 individual pictures every second. The only time I do something different is if I'm shooting something that I know I'm gonna put in slow motion. And for my videos, that's usually maybe kids laughing or people playing around or something like that, something fun. I'll shoot it at 60 frames per second. Because when you're working in slow motion, it's better to have more frames because you're not going to be playing all of those frames every second. And the more frames you can choose from, the smoother the slow motion picture is going to be. And then when I play it in slow motion, I play it at 40% speed. If you're taking a video that had 60 frames every second and you're playing at 40% speed, that's going to be 24 frames every second, which matches the frame rate of my final video. And so what that basically means is it's going to be the smoothest, most natural motion blur if you're taking a video and putting it in slow motion. So 24 frames per second, unless it's going to be something that I'm going to put in slow motion, which I'll then shoot at 60 frames per second. So you kind of have to plan ahead. As far as the shutter speed, which is basically how long you want the shutter to be open for every single one of those 24 frames that you take every second, they say a good rule of thumb is to keep it double the frame rate. So shutter speed is double the frame rate, and shutter speed, the number that's on there, if it says like if your shutter speed is 50, that actually means your shutter is open for 1/50th of a second. If it's 100, it's open for 1/100th of a second. So the higher the number, the quicker it opens and closes. The lower the number, the longer that shutter speed is open. So general rule of thumb, have your shutter speed twice as much as your frame rate. If your frame rate's 24 frames per second, your shutter speed is 48. Most cameras don't have 48, so you have to just go with what's closest. So I try to keep my shutter speed whenever I'm filming at 1/50th of a second. And finally, ISO, which is kind of the sensitivity to light that your camera has. The higher the ISO, the more sensitivity it has, the brighter your picture is going to be. The lower the ISO, the less sensitivity it has. If you're outside, you're going to have a low ISO. If you're inside, you're going to have a higher ISO. I try to keep it under 1000. Right now it's at 800. Once you start going over 1000, you get kind of a grainy look that is not super professional looking. This is an ISO of 6400, so as much as I can, I try to keep it under 1000, and then I adjust accordingly whether I'm inside or whether I'm outside. So to recap, 24 frames per second, 1080p, unless I'm shooting something that's slow motion, then I go 60 frames per second, and then I'm gonna slow it down to 40% later in post-production. Shutter speed at 1/50th of a second, and ISO, keep it under 1000, lower ISO if it's a really bright setting, higher ISO if it's a darker setting. As far as the settings that kind of impact the image quality, for a long time I kept it at natural. That kind of is like, they're not trying to make any of the colors bolder or any less bold than what they naturally are. It's just the most natural image. And then I would adjust it later when I'm editing the video. Recently, I kind of stole the settings from a guy named Devin Graham. His YouTube channel is Devin Supertramp. He talked about the different settings he uses so that he actually doesn't even have to edit the color in any way or his image in any way in the editing process. He captures it with these bold colors as it is using the camera. So I use his settings. On a Canon camera, his sharpness is set to 0, his contrast is set to -1, his saturation is set to +1, and his color tone is set to +1. He's got a video where he goes more in depth, and I'll link it right there if you want to check that out. But I've been liking those settings, and they've been working for me. And finally, white balance. I usually just keep this on auto, unless when I'm doing it on auto, I feel like my picture looks really funky. I've got all my other settings set to what I want it. For whatever reason, it looks kind of weird. And then I'll kind of scroll through the different settings that they have and then pick the color scheme that I feel is most what I want. You can kind of see here the different effects that they each have. Some of them are awful looking in the wrong context, and some of them look great, and you just kind of go with what you feel is the look that you're going for. So those are my camera settings. A year and a half ago, I didn't know what any of this stuff was. I'm learning it as I go, trial and error, seeing what works, what doesn't, and checking out what other people are doing. So let me know if you have any questions about these settings, and thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.
You can make peace by making your body be calm.